On May 21, 1982, Argentine bombs stopped failing, and in a single afternoon, the Royal Navy lost a war it had crossed the world to win. For weeks, the conflict in the South Atlantic had balanced on details almost too small to see: fuel margins, missile stocks, the arming time of a bomb falling from mast height. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The war itself began as it did in our world. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces seized the Falkland Islands on the orders of the junta, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, with Admiral Jorge Anaya, the invasion's chief architect. Britain answered within days, dispatching a naval task force 8,000 miles south. Its carrier battle group, built around HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. The opening blows fell hard and fast. On May 20, the submarine HMS Conqueror sank the cruiser ARA General Belgrano, killing 323 Argentine sailors and driving the Argentine surface fleet back to port for the rest of the war. 2 days later, an air-launched Exocet from a super-étendard struck HMS Sheffield, which burned and later sank, the first Royal Navy warship lost to enemy action since 1945. By mid-May, both sides understood the same brutal arithmetic. In this war, ships died quickly, but what neither side yet grasped, what would decide everything in the days ahead, was a flaw hidden inside the Argentine bombs themselves. The Argentine air campaign was run from the mainland by Brigadier Ernesto Crespo's Fuerza Aérea Sur, its A-4 Skyhawks and Dagger fighters flying at the very edge of their fuel range. To survive British missiles and guns, the pilots came in low, shockingly low, below the masts of the ships they attacked. Their courage was never in question, their weapons were. A bomb released at 50 feet has almost no time to fall. Its arming delay, designed to protect the aircraft that drops it, may still be running when the weapon strikes. In our history, this flaw went undiagnosed for weeks. Bomb after bomb punched into British hulls and simply lodged there, inert. Here, the timeline turns on a quieter kind of competence. After the first inconclusive strikes of early May, armorers at Rio Gallegos and San Julian worked backward from the pilots' reports, diagnosed the mismatch between release altitude and arming time, and adjusted the retard tails and fuse settings accordingly. It was not a new weapon, it was not a stroke of genius, it was maintenance, done in time. And on May 21, 1982, when British forces landed at San Carlos Water under Operation Sutton, the bombs that fell on the anchorage were ready to work exactly as designed. The landings began at dawn. Brigadier Julian Thompson's 3 Commando Brigade went ashore under the protection of an escort screen anchored in the confined waters of San Carlos. The amphibious ships under Commodore Michael Clapp crowded behind them. Then the jets came, wave after wave, hugging the ridgelines, releasing at heights where the defending gunners could see the pilots' helmets. In our history, roughly a dozen bombs struck British ships that week, without exploding, hits on Antrim, Argonaut, Antelope, and Broadsword that should have been fatal, and were not. In this timeline, they were. The bomb that in reality lodged in Antrim's flash magazine detonated inside her. Argonaut, hit twice, broke and settled. Broadsword, struck through the flight deck, burned. Brilliant. Raked, and then hit squarely in the follow-on raids, joined them. Ardent, fatally hit in both timelines, went down at the anchorage's southern approach. Sea Harrier patrols and missile batteries still took a steady toll of the attackers. The Argentine pilots paid heavily, as they did in reality. But by nightfall on May 21st, 5 British warships were sunk or sinking, and the air defense of San Carlos Water had effectively ceased to exist. The consequences of that single day would prove catastrophic. But to understand what happened next, you have to understand the one rule Woodward could never break. The carriers stayed east of the islands for a reason. Woodward knew, and said plainly, that losing either Hermes or Invincible would end the campaign in an afternoon. No carriers meant no Sea Harriers, no Sea Harriers meant no air cover, and no air cover meant no beachhead, no task force, no war. Every decision he made was bent around that fact. Now the arithmetic collapsed. With the escort screen gutted, The follow-up raids of May 22nd and 23 reached the supply ships in the anchorage almost unopposed, and the stores and ammunition the landing force needed began going down with them. The Exocet threat to the carriers had not diminished. The screen that shielded them had. Woodward advised Northwood that the carriers could not be risked closer inshore, and that without them, the men ashore could not be supported. It was not a counsel of despair. It was the same cold reasoning that had governed the whole campaign, arriving at its terrible conclusion. London weighed the alternatives and found none. The order came: withdraw the task force and take the landing force off the beaches. Thompson's Marines and paratroopers, ashore for barely 72 hours, were re-embarked under fighter cover stretched to its limit, and the fleet turned east. There was no way to dress up a retreat. Margaret Thatcher's government had staked itself entirely on retaking the islands. Her War Cabinet, Defense Secretary John Nott, Foreign Secretary Francis Pym, had told the country the task force would finish the job. Now the ships were coming home, and the Falklands were not. Nott resigned within days. His 1981 cuts to the surface fleet transformed overnight from a budget line into a national indictment. Thatcher fought on for a fortnight, but the confidence vote, when it came, saw her own backbenchers desert her, and the government fell. It was left to Pym in the caretaker interval that followed to negotiate the settlement. The islands under Argentine administration hedged with promises about islander rights that few in Britain believed and fewer in Buenos Aires intended to test. The Franks' inquiry of this timeline asked not why the war began, but why Britain had sent a fleet it could not afford to lose into range of an air force it could not stop. In Buenos Aires, the crowds that had filled the Plaza de Mayo in April filled it again, and this time the celebration did not curdle. Victory rescued Argentine military rule from its own economic failures, at least for a time. Galtieri rode the triumph as the general who had reclaimed the Malvinas. Anaya, the invasion's architect, stood vindicated beside him. Crespo's pilots became the heroes of a national legend. The pressure that in our history broke the junta and forced elections in 1983 simply dissipated, and with it went the reckoning. The accounting for the disappeared, the thousands taken during the dirty war, was postponed for years, buried under flags and anniversaries. The islands themselves became something stranger, a garrisoned trophy at the bottom of the world, expensive to hold, visited by almost no one. Their small British population dwindling under an administration that had won them as a symbol and had little use for them as a place. And then came the lesson the rest of the world drew, the one that would reshape every navy on Earth. Every naval staff studied San Carlos, and nearly all of them reached the same conclusion. A few dozen attack jets carrying iron bombs had destroyed a modern escort force in an afternoon. The details were argued endlessly: the confined waters, the absence of airborne early warning, the Harrier's short legs, but the headline was impossible to unsee. Surface ships within range of land-based air power died, and they died cheaply for the attacker. The United States Navy's carrier advocates fought a decade-long rearguard action, insisting that the lesson was not that carriers fail, but that small carriers without early warning aircraft fail, that an American battle group with its radar pickets aloft would have broken those raids far from the anchorage. They largely held their budgets, but the burden of proof had shifted onto them. The Soviet Navy read San Carlos as confirmation that its doctrine of massed air and missile attack against surface fleets was sound, and invested accordingly. And the smaller navies of the world quietly stopped ordering frigates. Strike aircraft and anti-ship missiles were cheaper, and San Carlos had shown what they could do. Through the last decade of the Cold War, the balance of naval spending tilted, fleet by fleet, away from the surface ship and toward the things that killed it. The Cold War ended with the Falklands flying the Argentine flag, and Britain a different country than the one we know. The post-imperial confidence that, in our history, the victory of 1982 restored was instead broken a decade early. The 1980s became the decade Thatcherism never happened, her successors governed in the shadow of the retreat, and the story Britain told about itself grew smaller. None of it required a different war. It required only that the bombs work. Because here is the real history hiding inside this one. The attacks happened. The pilots flew exactly these missions, at exactly these heights, against exactly these ships, and their bombs struck Antrim, Argonaut, Antelope, and Broadsword and did not explode, because the Fuzes never had time to arm. Only Ardent was fatally hit on May 21, and the beachhead held, and everything that followed the victory, the government, the decade rested on that failure. Air Chief Marshal Lord Craig said it plainly afterward: 6 better fuses, and Britain would have lost. The margin between the world we live in and the one described here was not a battle, or a fleet, or a leader's resolve. It was a few seconds of arming time, falling through the cold air over San Carlos water,